Hello, good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on whatever time you're watching this. There was a request to make a couple of videos on the upper limb, like quick revision videos on the muscles of the upper limb. So here we are. Let's kind of have a look at what the upper limb musculature comprises of. Now, mostly I'll be speaking only of the names of the muscle and showing them on the app to orient you anatomically. A few muscles I might also speak a little bit about the origin, insertion. The action and the nerve supply you will have to read from the textbook because we are trying to make a quick revision video, right? I want you to go back and open your textbooks after watching this. Uh, this is just a quick revision. So we'll be studying the muscles of the upper limb of the right side, the right superior extremity. Okay, let's just go in the same format that most of the textbooks go with. First, we'll be studying the chest region or the pectoral region, then the shoulder region, then we'll be studying about the back. After that, we'll be studying about the arm, then the forearm, and then the muscles of the hand. Okay, all of the right side. Let's start from the chest region. The first muscle we're going to consider is the pectoralis major. Now, these are actually the sternocostal fibers. The pectoralis major also has clavicular fibers and aponeurotic fibers that arise from the external oblique aponeurosis. Try to understand that the function of the clavicular fibers, the function of the sternocostal fibers, as well as the function of the aponeurotic fibers is the same in certain instances, but in certain other instances, the functions are slightly different. I want you to go and read about it. It's very interesting. Okay. The insertion is on the lateral lip of the bicipital sulcus of the humerus. Okay. I'm going to hide it now so you can have a look at the next one. The pectoralis minor originates from the third, fourth, and the fifth ribs, not the costal cartilages, just the ribs, and inserts on the medial aspect of the coracoid process, okay, the medial border. All right, read about the actions. Do not forget to mention the contribution in deep inspiration as well as protraction. Next, let's talk about the subclavius. Now, the subclavius is slightly deeper and is present on the inferior aspect of the clavicle. It arises from the subclavian groove, just hiding platysma. That's the subclavius. Its basic action is to stabilize the clavicle during the vigorous movements of the shoulder joint. Okay, see its insertion on the first rib, hiding that. Now, let's move on to the shoulder region. The shoulder region is obviously characterized by the presence of this rounded contour of the deltoid. The deltoid has anterior or clavicular fibers, middle or acromial fibers, and posterior or the fibers that arise from the spine of scapula. Okay, the action is very self-explanatory. It's the abductor of the shoulder, but do understand how the anterior fibers help in flexion and the posterior fibers help in extension at the shoulder joint. Okay, the insertion is on the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. Okay, let's hide these. And now let's move to the muscles of the back. Firstly, I'm going to describe the muscles of the scapular region. Okay, let's just get done with the trapezius first because it's a superficial muscle of the back. This is the vast, extensive trapezius. It arises from the superior nuchal line as well as the cervical vertebrae and the thoracic vertebrae. Read the details about where exactly it comes from. And the insertion goes on the lateral aspect of the clavicle as well as the upper border of the spine of scapula. Can you see that? Do read about the actions. Do read about its role in overhead abduction, especially the upper and lower fibers. Okay, let's move on to the scapular muscles. Now, first I'm going to speak about the supraspinatus, the initiator of abduction. Okay, it's inserting on a facet on the greater tubercle of humerus. Okay, the uppermost facet. Then let's talk about the infraspinatus. See where it's arising from? the infraspinous fossa, just like the supraspinatus arose from the supraspinous fossa. Insertion, once again, greater tubercle of the humerus, the middle facet, and the lowermost facet is giving insertion to the teres minor. Okay, the teres minor. Let's have a closer look at the origin of the teres minor. Lateral border, that's your teres minor. Okay? Great. Next is the teres major, which kind of comes from the lower aspect of the scapula. But look at its beautiful course. It is not going posteriorly. It is going anteriorly to be inserted on the medial lip of the intertubercular sulcus. Okay? So, it's going to contribute to medial rotation. The previous two contributed to lateral rotation, but this one is contributing to medial rotation of the humerus. Okay? Perfect. Now I'm going to speak about the muscles that arise from the medial border or are attached on the medial border of the scapula. Okay? There's one over here which we barely talk about. That's the omohyoid. We'll be studying that in detail in the neck. Okay? Then we've got the levator scapulae, as the name suggests. It elevates the scapula. You can see how it's attached to the superior angle of the scapula. Hiding it now. Next, we have the rhomboidus minor and the rhomboidus major. Okay? Both attached to the medial border of the scapula on the dorsal aspect. There is something that is attached to the medial border of the scapula on the ventral aspect, and we shall see that shortly. I'm going to hide these. Okay? Don't worry about these. Serratus posterior superior, serratus posterior inferior. The only thing I can say about them is these are the muscles that get contracted when you suddenly take a cold shower. Okay? Alright. Now, I want to speak about the serratus anterior. It's a beautiful, beautiful muscle. And it is arising from the medial border, but the ventral aspect of the scapula. Okay? This is the dorsal aspect of the scapula. We can't really see the medial aspect of the ventral scapula because of the other structures right now, but just understand that it arises from 8 ribs and it has an important role in overhead abduction as well as protraction, where it assists the pectoralis minor. Okay? Great. The last muscle that is also the deepest, considering the current scenario, is the subscapularis. The subscapularis arises from the ventral aspect of the scapula, the subscapular fossa. It is multipennate, that's an important point, and it is inserted on the lesser tubercle of the humerus. It is responsible for medial rotation of the humerus. Okay? Hiding it now. So far, we studied the pectoralis major, which is more of an adductor and a medial rotator and a flexor of the arm. Then we studied the deltoid, whose middle fibers are primarily abductors of the arm, while the anterior and posterior fibers were helping in flexion and extension respectively. Okay. Then we studied the trapezius. Then we studied the supraspinatus, the initiator of abduction. Then we studied the infraspinatus and teres minor, which were lateral rotators. Then we studied the teres major, which was a medial rotator. Then we studied the subscapularis, which once again is a medial rotator. Okay, I hope that you're understanding how the action can be deduced by just being familiar with the anatomical orientation and using your imagination. Okay? Great. Now, let's move on to the muscles of the arm. Okay? The muscles of the arm, we have the anterior and the posterior compartment. The anterior compartment consists of 3 muscles: coracobrachialis, biceps, and brachialis. The coracobrachialis is the smallest one. It represents the degenerated adductor compartment of the arm. Origin is the tip of the coracoid process. Insertion is mid-shaft on the medial side of the humerus. Okay? Then we've got the biceps brachii. Okay? This is the short head which arises from the tip of the coracoid process, while the long head, remember, is arising from the supraglenoid tubercle and traverses from the inside of the capsule of the shoulder joint. Hence, the peculiarity is intracapsular origin of the tendon of the long head of the biceps. You can also see how it traverses in the bicipital sulcus, where it is accompanied by the ascending branch of the anterior circumflexhumeral artery. What? Well, if you can remember that, good for you. If you can't, take it easy. Life is not all about remembering anatomical structures. This little thing over here is actually the tubular synovial sheath, which prevents friction, okay? Can you see that? That's the long head. That's the short head. Together, both of them form the biceps brachii. The insertion is once again very, very cool. There's a tendinous insertion which inserts on the radial tuberosity of the radius, and there's an aponeurotic insertion which forms the roof of the cuboidal fossa, okay? The roof of the cuboidal fossa. It's known as the bicipital aponeurosis. It just blends with the deep fascia of the forearm. Read about it. Let's hide it and let's talk about the deeper muscle. Now, this is the brachialis. The brachialis originates from most of the anterior surface of the shaft of the lower aspect of humerus, and it inserts on the ulnar tuberosity of the ulna, okay? Both of these are flexors of the elbow, but it would be nice if we could find out which one of these is a spurt muscle and which one of these is a shunt muscle. Furthermore, you can read a little bit more about shunt and spurt muscles. It's very interesting, okay? So all these three muscles of the anterior compartment of the arm, coracobrachialis, biceps brachii, and brachialis, are supplied by the musculocutaneous nerve. Remember, the musculocutaneous nerve, even after supplying these, has a cutaneous course in the forearm where it continues as the lateral cutaneous nerve of the forearm, okay? Let's talk about the only muscle in the posterior compartment of the arm, and that is the triceps brachii. So this is the long head which arises from the infraglenoid tubercle. You can see that. This is the lateral head which arises from a linear origin very closely associated to the radial groove. Okay, so on the lateral side of the radial groove. And finally, we have the medial head, okay? Finally, we have the medial head, and you can see that here. Let me just hide this one so that we can find out where the medial head exactly is coming from, okay? Now, this is the medial head. Can you see that? It's coming from most of the posterior aspect of the shaft of the humerus. There are these certain muscles that arise from the shaft of bones, and these are extensive fleshy origins. Brachialis was one example, and this is the other one. The term that they use is extensive fleshy origins because they arise from most of the surface of the shaft, okay? So this is the medial head of the triceps brachii. Okay, let's hide that now. You can see the naked humerus, and there's the radial nerve, there's the axillary nerve, and there's the ulnar nerve that is intimately in contact with this bone, but we'll speak about that in a session on osteology. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the muscles of the forearm. Remember that I haven't spoken yet about the latissimus dorsi, and if you want me to, I could just quickly tell you that it has an extensive origin once again. It arises from the lower thoracic vertebra, it arises from the thoracolumbar fascia, and there is also origins from the iliac crest. And the insertion is on the lower angle of the scapula, a few fibers on the lower angle of the scapula, okay? And the primary insertion, or the final insertion, is actually in the floor of the bicipital sulcus, in between the lateral and the medial lips. Can you see that? And you can see how the insertion is twisting, just like the insertion of the pectoralis major, mind you, read about it. The pectoralis major as well as the latissimus dorsi have twisted insertions. Okay, observe the twisting. Okay, great. I'm going to hide that now, and we're going to go to the muscles of the forearm. Okay, just going to hide the bicep. Don't know why I haven't hidden it yet. Hiding the brachialis. There you go, that's the naked humerus. Now let's have a look at the muscles of the forearm. You might want to pause and take a break There's already too much that has happened. I'll continue this as part 2.